Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Todd Eisenstadt. I'm a professor of government in the School of Public Affairs. And on behalf of the Center for Environmental Policy, it gives me really a great pleasure to welcome you to a series of discussions that we are going to be having this spring. There's a lecture series which we're presenting online on some Thursdays, usually at about 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, on ideas, interests, institutions, and nation-state politics, mitigators, adapters, and mitigator-adapters. And, what does this mean? Really what it means is that we're trying to talk in terms of climate change policy, not just about mitigation, which is how climate change is usually referenced, mitigation being reducing emissions of greenhouse gases worldwide. As many of you know, the United Nations is concerned that, that we may not be able to keep climate change or global warming to the 1.5 degrees Celsius that scientists have determined would be necessary in order for us to avoid the worst of climate change. So the effort to avoid the worst will be undertaken through mitigation over the years and decades ahead. So mitigation is not new. I mean, we've been studying it and working on it for decades. Adaptation, that is the acceptance that climate change is happening and that nation states have to adjust, that is a newer concept in terms of public policy. And so really what we're going to do as part of this series is talk also about the need to adapt. And sometimes mitigation and adaptation can come into conflict in terms of nations' priorities, given that, budgets and resources are limited, that many estimate that solving climate change is going to cost, 1 or 2% of the world's gross domestic product or its production over the next couple of decades, if we're going to really tame this problem and get it under control. So really the series is going to address the question of what countries are doing to mitigate as well as to adapt. Some of the presenters are going to focus more on the mitigation side, some a little more on the adaptation side, but ideally we'll have a mix of both. And we will get perspectives in the course of this webinar series from an introductory discussion, which is going to happen today. I'm going to present with a Ph.D. student in the School of Public Affairs, Jennifer Lopez. And after we present our paper, which is on trying to understand ways to measure international and domestic mitigation policy stringency, because stringency is really what it's about. It's about ambitious or stringent policies that are strong enough to actually help reduce emissions. So Jennifer and I are going to present today. We're going to be very fortunate to be joined in discussion by colleague Carleen West, who's a professor of political science and international relations at SUNY Geneseo, who specializes in Latin American politics with an emphasis on comparative institutions, political representation, and the politics of sustainability. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and the Latin American Public Opinion Project, and she's been publishing in leading journals, including Comparative Political Studies, Latin American Research Review, and her recent book, Candidate Matters, a study of ethnic parties, campaigns, and elections in Latin America, was published by Oxford University Press recently. And she is an adroit methodologist who I'm sure is going to take us to task on some of the methodological questions and the premise of our paper. We also have with us Paul Bugala, who's an independent sustainable investment analyst who helps create avenues for capital markets investment, public policy, and international development to reflect the materiality of human rights and environmental responsibility. he has worked for more than 10 years on the integration of these issues into sustainability and rights-based development in the oil, gas, and mining industries at Calvert Investments, Oxfam America, and as an independent investment analyst. And Paul will bring, no doubt, his policy perspective to bear on the conclusions. And the only other thing I want to say before we get started, as you know, we may run out of time in asking you to register for the rest or whichever of the remaining of these webinars that you can attend. The next one will be on February 24th, and Claire DuPont will be speaking about the European Union as an exemplary mitigator. Is it just the best of a bad lot? After that, we will have Adele Thomas speaking on loss and damage as the third pillar of climate action. I should say that DuPont is from the University of Ghent, and Thomas is from the University of the Bahamas. After Thomas, we will be going into a discussion of China. In April, we will discuss vulnerability and climate change policies in the Middle East and North Africa. We will have a presentation on the US and then on Brazil. And then we will also go into discussion of some of the sort of broader scaled up solutions to talk about sort of what can the international community do? What can domestic governments do? How can we, effectively solve this problem? So let's get into the question of how to even measure the problem. And I'm going to share slides and also introduce Department of Government Political Science Ph.D. student Jennifer Lopez. I'm going to start in 1 second here. Let me just see if I can advance my screen. Okay. And just to start by saying that, in fact, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Figueres said in the run-up to the Glasgow UN summit in the fall of 2021 that the world is on a catastrophic pathway. And so the question is, what does that mean? And it seems that really for natural scientists and climate modelers, what it means is how do we keep climate change within acceptable levels? And the natural scientists have done a good job indeed in trying to answer this question. And the United Nations established a cap of climate change expectations at 2 degrees Celsius, which is close to, over 4 degrees Fahrenheit, close to 5 degrees, but ideally to keep it within 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is from the start of the Industrial Revolution through the end of the 21st century. So that's about, I think, over 3 degrees Fahrenheit. So the question for social scientists, now that the natural scientists have established this baseline, the question for us as social scientists, and probably for political scientists, as we're going to frame it today, is how do we get the United Nations, national governments, and others to comply and to generate and create powerful and strong policies? And I guess the prior question to that is one that also bears asking, which is even how do we measure what even is an effective policy? There's been a lot of talk about what works to try and help solve climate change, or at least diminish the effects. But, we have measures of diminishment of emissions, but we're still not sure exactly which policies are the most effective and how to solve this problem using domestic government policies. Okay, so along those lines, this is just an indication of that the climate modelers, such as those at the Climate Action Tracker, have very precise and specific estimates of where they see global warming reaching, the sort of what their range of expectation is. Social scientists don't have such a range of expectations. So we have questions which have been, whoops, I'm so sorry. We have questions. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Our questions are about whether, in general, the problem is an international one, which was largely stated by Eleanor Ostrom in The Tragedy of the Commons, which is interpreted in the climate change area to be one where the United Nations is responsible for addressing the problems of the global commons, which includes the atmosphere. And again, so this is a problem at the international level, according to this general idea, and that, we have the Paris Agreement, the United Nations agreement, which went into effect in 2015 to try and help us resolve the worst of this problem, which is a problem of the commons area that all of us share. All of us in common are the stewards of the atmosphere and therefore of the emissions that affect it and which raise the temperature. So that's the older theory. A newer one is one that, domestic interests are really causing some of the conflict, that there are obstructions to domestic climate policy by groups such as probably fossil fuel interests, right? Which, as we will note in our statistical analysis, fossil fuel subsidies are extremely high, accounting for up to, 36% of GDP in Russia every year, and in the US representing about 3% of GDP. So in fact, fossil fuel subsidies, which actually predate discussions of climate change and go back decades, are an important factor in considering emissions. We are looking at domestic policy, however, as conscious policies that are established by governments expressly to address emissions and climate change. So we're looking at policies that emerge later and trying to understand their causal role in emissions and emissions reduction. So the question of how do we measure policy stringency is a hard one. And the other part of the question is, if we measure policy stringency at the domestic level and at the international level, that is, how do we get more stringent or ambitious policies? And then the question is, how do those policies get implemented in a way that helps us actually solve the problem of climate change, or at least ameliorate global warming? Okay, so we think that the rubber meets the road at the domestic level. And we think that, in fact, de facto, the international community recognized this by establishing that the nationally determined contributions by countries at the United Nations are the foundational building blocks of the emissions reduction regime that is in place at the national level. In other words, each nation is asked by the United Nations to volunteer its pledge for how much it's going to reduce emissions. And those pledges are combined and aggregated upward into a total, which then becomes the expected reduction in emissions over a given time period, 5 or 8 years in the prior case. And the locus of implementation of policy resides at the domestic level. The nation states must come forth with these NDCs, with these nationally determined contributions. They are not imposed upon countries by the United Nations. They are bottom up from the countries rather than top down from the United Nations. Okay, so what we're going to do is convey the view that countries lead with their international policy. That is, that international policy, the policies, the statements, the treaties that nations sign tend to be more ambitious at the international level than what they actually do at the domestic level. This isn't anything new to anyone who's watched a fair number of these annual United Nations climate summits and seen the strong and strident declarations made, and then tried to follow up on how many of them are actually implemented, which isn't, frankly, not that many. And so the argument isn't a novel one, but what is novel, and what Jennifer and I also heard this morning from a European-based group of environmental policy analysts, is that there really isn't a way to measure domestic policy stringency or international policy stringency about which there is much consensus. So that is really the achievement and sort of the sum of our contribution. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to compose indexes, one for domestic policy, domestic climate policy, one for international climate policy, and we're going to apply those to how they shape total emissions. We're using the year of 2018 for total emissions. We're using international climate agreements preceding the Paris Agreement. So the international policy variable temporally precedes the domestic policy variable, which is based mostly on data gathered also around 2018. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. I think it's also important to note that we're going to talk about several other variables that also have an effect, for example, on emissions besides domestic policy and international policy. So we're going to first establish how we construct the indexes. Then we're going to argue about which of the variables that we use are relevant in causing changes in overall emissions. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the causes of international and domestic policy using those policy indexes that we've constructed. And then finally, we're going to talk about series of cases, different profiles of countries, and how it is that when we have these indexes and we define cases into high or low boxes in terms of their domestic and international policy, how in fact this does create coherent ideal types of nation states and how they cohere together as four groups, which we'll talk about also in the course of this discussion. All right, so just conceptually, I'm gonna, after this, turn it over to Jennifer, but just to say that in general, the indexes that we constructed, again, use the international treaties and climate-related agreements preceding the Paris Agreement, and the domestic index really stems from three policy outcomes, one of which is whether countries put a price on carbon and what that price is, whether it's high or low, whether the country in question has pledged net zero emissions by 2050, which is an increasing movement worldwide, but which not everyone has joined. And third, whether countries in their nationally determined contributions, which they put forth to the United Nations, whether those pledges offer concrete emissions reductions or not, because many of them do not offer specific concrete reductions, while some of the more ambitious ones do. All right, I'm going to turn the floor or the share of the screen over to my co-author, Jennifer Lopez, and turn the slides for you.
Thank you. So these are the four variables that were included in the models that we'll show later on. The first was domestic ambition, which was an index composed of the previous indicators, and then international ambition and fossil fuel subsidies. These were explicit subsidies, so based on current price and production costs. And then the last one was clientelism and budget size. Okay, next slide, Todd. So this is more detail on the actual construction on the indices. So for international ambition, we included three treaties, which was the Montreal Protocol, the Convention on Biodiversity, and Kyoto Protocol. These were coded based on the time that the countries signed and ratified these treaties. So if they signed them within the 3 years, they were assigned a 1. After those 3 years, it was a 0.5. And if they did not sign or ratify at all, it was a 0. For domestic ambition, for carbon pricing, this was based on the actual price given to carbon. So if it was over $20 per metric ton, it was given a 2. If it was below that, it was given a 1. If there's no carbon pricing policy, then it was given a 0. As Todd mentioned, for the net zero status and NDC rating, this was based on the strength of the policy. So if it was at all codified through law or through actual policy, then it was given a higher weight. Okay, next slide, Todd. This was the main model that we ran, where we used 2018 greenhouse gas emissions as a dependent variable. And the first variable that should be focused on is international ambition. And this was significant in the full sample and the top emitters. And as we can see, it was negatively associated. So as international ambition increased, greenhouse gas emissions decreased. The second variable that it can be seen as very important in the models is the fossil fuel subsidies. So these were important. These were statistically significant in all of the models, including the basic model. So the relationship with fossil fuel subsidies with these is positive. So as fossil fuel subsidies increase, greenhouse gas emissions also increase. Other variables had statistical significance, but they were not present in all of the models. Like for example, budget size, oil rents, and these like oil rents were negatively associated. So as they increased, greenhouse gas emissions decreased, and the same relationship was seen with budget size. Okay, next slide, Todd. So we ran similar models for international ambition to see what we could say could contribute to the signing and ratifying of these treaties. Okay, next slide. So from these models, we can see that oil rents were once again significant and negative. So as they rose, international ambition decreased. And domestic ambition was also statistically significant, but only in the basic model. Once we add all the other covariates, the statistical significance disappears from the models. And no other variable really had a significant association other than the oil rents. Okay, next slide. And then we ran similar models for domestic ambition as well. Next slide. For these, the most important variable was clientelism. It was negative and significant. So as clientelism increased in a country, domestic ambition decreased. Government budget size was also significant, but only in the full sample. So once the sample was subsetted to just the top emitters, this disappeared. Oil rents were significant and positively associated once again, but only among the top emitters. And we can see that within the top emitters, explicit fossil fuel subsidies were also significant, but these were negatively associated. So as fossil fuel subsidies increased, domestic ambition decreased. International ambition was also significant, but only among the top emitters once we accounted for all the other variables. Okay, next slide. So with international and domestic ambition, comparisons across countries can be difficult, mainly because we see some outliers, mostly in Europe. So with this in mind, we thought that it might be beneficial to look at subsamples based on the domestic and international ambition levels seen. Okay, and now I'm handing it back to Todd.
Okay, great. And yes, we did try to take a look at this dividing the countries into sort of those which had low domestic versus high domestic, and low international versus high international. So the group that had both low, that is low stringency in domestic policy and low stringency in international policy, included a lot of countries from the poorer regions of the global south, but also countries with some of them with conflict. In other words, they were outliers to some extent. They accounted for about 11% of global emissions. Another group of outliers is in cell C, which is the group that has domestic policy high and international policy low. Those countries were harder to characterize as a singular group, but I should say it did include the US and Canada, which have both been somewhat erratic, for example, with regard to the Kyoto Protocol and their implementation or lack thereof of Kyoto, which in part accounts for their low international ranking. Now, the high international, high domestic is sort of we call them in cell D the net zero champions. Those only account for about 16% of global emissions, but it includes most of the European cases, which are really the exemplars. And then in cell B, we call them the politically motivated high emitters. I mean, that was the group of countries that didn't necessarily agree, for example, to have their emissions counted under Kyoto, which have argued for, in part, economic development as well as environmental protection. Countries like China and India, as well as some of the others which have been obstructive at UN meetings and difficult to pin down with regard to commitments to reducing emissions, like Australia, Russia, Venezuela. The interesting thing is that, again, the countries break down into these ideal types fairly readily. In other words, even though the indexes we constructed were far from perfect, and I guess we can talk about that a bit later, they are good in terms of serving illustrative purposes of characterizing countries within certain groups and sort of how they behave somewhat similarly. I'm sorry, I'm trying to back up. Whoops, I'm not backing up successfully. Whoops. Anyway, excuse me for that. I'm sorry, 1 second. I lost where we were briefly. Anyway, all right. We did take cases and sort of look at within the groups of cases. We ran statistical analysis, and for example, group D and B, which were the biggest emitters, those demonstrated that fossil fuel subsidies were, in fact, in all of those cases, a cause of emissions. In group A, which is the countries that were often, poor countries in conflict, for them, international ambition was also statistically significant. Higher level of international ambition, and in fact, yields increases in emissions for that group, which was an anomalous finding. But it's a small group, and we think that they had difficulty perhaps with execution of policy commitments, and we're not going to count that group as being extremely indicative. For the other two groups, the ones that were large parts of the emissions equation, case D, the climate champions, and case B, the sort of politically motivated emitters, international ambition was not statistically significant in this run. I should say that we're not quite finished with the statistical analysis, and since we ran these a couple of days ago, we've run others that have in fact shown somewhat different results. But I guess that the key takeaway here is that when you divide countries into these kinds of four boxes based on level of domestic and international ambition, there are some patterns and consistencies that emerge in their behavior, but they're not entirely, those patterns don't hold throughout. All right, so I guess, overall, we would argue that our domestic policy measure in particular did not cohere. The index, the three variables didn't create a strong composition. It was below 0.5, which is, in other words, it was not extremely high. It was close to 0.5. It was mediocre. It wasn't poor, it was mediocre. And in fact, we would argue that it's better than the other ones that exist, which we just confirmed with our colleagues in Europe. Really, there aren't any. So, the other variable that you see is strongly significant is the, fossil fuel subsidies. And it has been argued perhaps that fossil fuel subsidies are the nation's true domestic climate policy, because as go the fossil fuel subsidies, so go emissions. High subsidies, high emissions. So that may be true, and that is the most powerful variable. And frankly, what this means is that that's the biggest obstacle at the national level, we think, to stringent climate policy domestically. However, we decided that we didn't want to count that as domestic climate policy because, again, a lot of the fossil fuel subsidies precede the discussion of climate change. And so really, it did not emerge as a function of reducing emissions or increasing them or addressing them. Fossil fuel subsidies were already there. And look, domestic economies were already captured by fossil fuel industries before the climate debate started in earnest in the 1990s, probably. So anyway, that's a strong finding. I think that in conclusion, we have demonstrated in these statistical findings to some extent, and even more in subsequent versions of the paper, which we can make available to you if you give us your email. We found that, that domestic policy, international policy is a factor in emissions changes, whereas domestic policy, not so much, especially when you add in the full model, the other variables that we added in and showed you. And again, we ran two samples. We ran top emitters, the, couple of dozen top emitters versus the entire sample of 181 countries. So the results were mostly consistent, and what we call leading with the international, the propensity of countries to make strong declarations at the international level and sign treaties and provide leadership at that level, does not trickle down to the domestic level, where in fact climate policy is much less developed and much less ambitious. And so I think that's the takeaway from this discussion. And with that, I think we should thank very much our colleagues who are going to join us in the discussion. And we turn now to Dr. Carleen West of SUNY Geneseo.
Yes, thank you so much, Todd. It's really my pleasure to be here today. I very much enjoyed reading this paper, and I really appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this discussion on those important policy arenas in which climate change is discussed. And I just want to highlight just one thing about my background, which Todd already said, but this paper is very much focused on kind of the international arena in conjunction with the domestic arena. And my area of expertise is the domestic arena. I'm a comparative political scientist, and my work has historically focused on the role that domestic institutions, things like the executive and the legislature and elections, how those institutions matter for policy outputs. And so I am going to focus a little bit on that today, just bringing in my own expertise. But as I said before, I'm really pleased really pleased to be here. So I just want to start off by saying that I think that this is a really important paper. This is addressing a very important question about the extent to which international policy or domestic policy matters more when it comes to actually making efforts to curb climate change. I think the paper does a really nice job of summarizing the debate that exists within policy circles, but also within political science about, where is the level at which we can actually make the most change, policy output changes, and the most impact when it comes to climate change. And so often there is all of this emphasis put on, as Todd introduced in his discussion, there's so much emphasis put on coordinating countries, right, at the international level. All of the countries need to work together to fight this problem because it's a global problem. And yet, I think what this paper also does is call our attention to some other really important variables that exist at the domestic level, but also at what I would say is the kind of multinational level. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those in my comments today. And so I think the first thing that is really interesting that the paper does is that it does kind of suggest that international ambition, so what countries do internationally, the commitments that they make in the international arena, that those are important and that they do seem to have some impact on specifically, and this is one of my praises for the paper, there seems to be a correlation between international policy commitments and actual outputs of greenhouse gases. So the fact that this paper can show that there does seem to be that correlation, that relationship, I think is a really interesting finding, because the narrative surrounding international policy commitments tends to be one of, they don't matter, right? Because there is no way that international organizations really can enforce these policy commitments. And what I think this paper does is it calls into question that narrative and seems to suggest that international policy commitments do indeed matter. And I think that that's a really interesting and important finding to explore further. However, this is the comparativist in me coming out. I think the question remains, why does international ambition seem to have this impact on greenhouse gas emissions, particularly when the findings that domestic policy ambition has kind of spotty correlations with greenhouse gas emissions? So why is it that international policy seems to more consistently matter, whereas domestic ambition does not seem to matter as much, or at least not as consistently throughout the models that are presented in this paper? And I just want to give the authors, Professor Eisenstadt and doctoral student Jennifer Lopez, just some things to think about, because as a comparativist, I always bring it back to the domestic, right? So if countries are entering into international agreements or making these international policy commitments, from my perspective, the only way they can lower greenhouse gases is by actually making policy changes domestically or being domestically ambitious, right? So it just really makes me wonder, what is the actual causal mechanism by which countries are lowering their greenhouse gases, if it isn't that they're also being domestically ambitious? And so, I start thinking about the causal story here. And I wonder, could it be that countries that are domestically ambitious, right, so that they're making changes domestically to try to curb their own greenhouse gases, are also those that are willing to be more ambitious in the international arena? In other words, which comes first? And the thesis of the paper seems to be that the international leads, but I do wonder if it's possible that the domestic arena is playing an important role here. And so, one thing that makes me really think about this is that in the paper, there is a finding that the international policy stringency variable, or the international policy ambition variable, does seem to be at least partially explained by ambition in the domestic arena, at least for top emitters, right? And so I think that there could be some kind of conditional effect be happening here, which is that, depending on the level of ambition that exists at the domestic level, there could be differential effects at the international level. In other words, when you split out the samples in later analyses, you show specifically that domestic ambition and international ambition are correlated for those high emitting countries. And so what I think you could do actually is very easily include an interaction variable that would account for this kind of conditionality, right? Which would allow you to show the extent to which international ambition matters, given the extent to which domestic ambition exists, right? Because I'm sort of thinking about it like, for some countries, they're just going and making these promises, these international promises, and then it's having like no impact at the domestic level. They're not doing anything domestically. And so for those countries, the international policy isn't really going to have much of an impact. Or maybe it's the reverse, that, when those countries make those international policy commitments, if they have nothing going on domestically, maybe that's where we see the impact. Whichever the case it may be, if you include that interaction term, you'll be able to assist or assess the conditionality of those variables, like for which countries, depending on the domestic sphere, which countries are those that really are led by the international, by their international commitments. Let's see, I don't want to take up too much time. I just want to say, just before I close here, that I actually really like the taxonomy of the countries that you create. I think that's an incredibly useful methodological schema that you have there. And I actually think you could start your discussion of your results with that taxonomy and then utilize the taxonomy in your analysis. So you could create dummy variables that represent those 4 different types that you identify, interact those dummy variables with things like fossil fuel subsidies to really give power to your argument that the fossil fuel subsidies matter more for certain countries and certain country types. The last thing that I want to close on, I just feel like I would be remiss to not say this, because what this paper ultimately did for me is to leave me with the question of, what are we going to do about the powerful fossil fuel lobby, right? So yes, we have these organizations that are focused on getting climate commitments from countries, these international organizations, but really what we need to be talking about is the role of international governance in regulating huge multinational corporations like fossil fuel companies, because the findings in your paper really show just how much fossil fuel subsidies and oil rents can matter for these outcomes. And so I just want to call that into it, just leave you with that thought that was one of the main questions that I walked away from this paper thinking is, can international institutions, maybe even like the WTO or IMF, can they assist in regulating huge multinational corporations like the fossil fuel industry? And is that an area in which we should be turning our focus now, given the spotty influence that international policy commitments can have on actual outcomes? So again, thank you so much for this opportunity for discussing the paper, And at this point, I'll turn it over to our guest, Paul Bugala, who will be talking about the paper as well.
Thank you, Professor West, and thank you, Professor Eisenstadt and doctoral candidate Lopez. I'm so grateful that Professor West started this discussion with such a thorough review of the methodological strengths and areas for improvement of this paper overall, because that is well beyond my capacity to share. And I would also like to thank the School of Public Affairs and everyone involved for inviting me here. But I think what I'll try to do and give a little bit of background on where I come from all this is to look at a couple of the points of the paper and the methodology and where I think the strengths are, but also to pick up on Professor West's point about what are we to do to address the influence of the fossil fuel sector here, and with a little background on where we're starting as far as the influence of the fossil fuel sector and their motivations are. And so by way of explanation, as Professor Eisenstadt mentioned earlier, I am an investment analyst, and particularly been a securities analyst whose portfolio included energy and materials companies or mining companies, basically. And so I've dealt with the valuation of those companies and investment decisions about them, especially those that involve factoring in environmental, social, and governance factors like the ones that are highlighted in this paper. So I'm kind of an interesting third party, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but I'm a different audience maybe than Professor West for this information. And one of the other things I've done extensively over the last 15 or so years is do advocacy with oil companies in particular in setting goals and targets around climate change emissions and things along those lines. And it's been a bumpy road, and I'm going to try to draw on some of that to inform my brief comments here. But first, with the report itself, I think I also have a real strong interest in the resource curse and the implications of the paradox of plenty and the degree to which oil rents, for example, can have a detrimental effect on governance and development outcomes in countries that are resource rich. And the findings around Cube A in particular, and the impact of royalty rents made my antenna go up around that issue in particular, and the possibility where when a country's government is so dependent upon royalty rents that it ignores the needs and the welfare of its citizens, it plays out over and over again. And this seemed like another area where that's possible just in the context of climate change rather than the other kind of things you can see in places like Equatorial Guinea around education or healthcare. Also, I thought I really did like that cells A through D structure as well, and would be, as the paper points out too, would be really eager to see further research like this take a longitudinal approach, and hope that through improvements in the IMF data, but also maybe through other policy avenues, that sort of information could become more readily available. But really, I think, as Professor West pointed out, the importance of the influence of the fossil fuel sector in this whole discussion is really unavoidable. And I think one of the key differences that occurred to me as I read through this was a difference between the international and domestic policy, at least as it relates to the United States and its ambitions, is that the American Petroleum Institute and the industry itself isn't necessarily at the table explicitly in those international discussions, but plays a significant role on the domestic policy end of that. And you can see that in the context of how the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol happened in the United States, all the way through Waxman and Markey, and now our current discussions. And I'm going to get to the current discussions quickly, but I really want to point out that putting on my securities analyst hat, I can tell you that what makes fossil fuel companies in general and oil companies in particular a good investment is the persistence in the demand for oil. The idea that the world will always need oil and that its demand is increasing is really repeated over and over again in earnings calls. And so when you're an equity or stock analyst using a discounted cash flow model to figure out what price you would be willing to pay for an oil company stock, the most important factor is the price of oil. It's not, the effectiveness of management. It's not, where their projects are. These are all really important things as well. But the most important part is the price of oil. And so it's important to understand that any threat to the demand of oil, including disclosure or reduction of fossil fuel subsidies or decrease of demand through alternative energy or carbon pricing and things along these lines are very sensitive topics for the industry and a difficult point to get them to move on. Now, I think a really strong case can be made that fossil fuel subsidies create an inefficiency in securities prices, that at the very least, they should be disclosed so that investors can price them in and understand the difference between a company that's succeeding because it's able to affect capture and clientelism and a company that's doing the best it can at finding resources and marketing them without having those things. But in the context of policy solutions, this is a lot of what I do, is look at a policy situation and try to find the investor angle to it. And one of the big ones in the context of fossil fuel subsidies is the interplay between them and carbon tax, especially in the United States. The American Petroleum Institute has shown willingness to at least say nominally that it supports a carbon tax, but if you look a little further below the surface, you'll see that they're calling for a revenue neutral carbon tax, which is one that will essentially would involve increasing fossil fuel subsidies to cover up any of the revenue downside that would be affected by a carbon tax. So that is an example of the degree to which we're kind of dealing with situations where we need dramatic changes in the flow of capital, in fossil fuel, in GHG emissions, and then the party on the other side of the table is talking about a zero-sum type solution. And so I think one of the major barriers of getting past that point is being really clear about what fossil fuel subsidies are, because they include things like tax incentives, subsidized fuels, but also, as the IMF data brings in, externalities like the climate impact of a tax-related expression of the climate impact of fossil fuel reserves. And so we've had, I think, in the policy realm, there are a lot of different ways to get at these different points. And one of the big ones, I think, is through tax disclosure, through corporate tax disclosure along the lines of what is required by Section 1504 of the Dodd-Frank Act, or also the disclosure of tax havens and offshoring act, or even right now in the context of the current discussion that the SEC is having around climate risk disclosure issues. And one of the big considerations in all of that is materiality, is the idea of will investors use this information, would a reasonable investor use this information to make investment decisions? And I think this paper and its incisive perspective on the role of the industry in affecting public policy really shows that there's a group of stakeholders for whom that type of information is very valuable as well and need to be heard. And so I'm really grateful for this research, because it advances that idea that there's a much broader group of people who would be an effective audience for things like tax policy data and payment information than is often conventionally understood. And so I'm really looking forward to discussing all of this further, and I'm grateful to be part of this group. And I think maybe I'll just stop right there and see if we are going to turn and open it up to broader questions.
Great. Thank both of you for some very informed and thoughtful comments. I guess I'll just see, we'll maybe respond for a minute or two, and then we'll open it up. Maybe Jennifer, would you like to to start?
Yeah, I just mostly wanted to say that the differential effects was a good point, and adding the interactions is something we can easily do. So it's a really good idea, and I just wanted to thank you for your comments.
Thank you to Professor West and also to Mr. Bugala. The question of the effect of fossil fuel subsidies seems, in your view, to be extremely strong. I just want to say also that we only used the explicit subsidies in the IMF data, because if we had used explicit plus implicit, which is some of the other sort of assumptions about subsidies that you mentioned, it swamps our models even more. So I guess you're making a strong case for this domestic interest argument, is what it sounds like to us, and that you're advocating strongly for future disclosures relating to the amount of subsidies and a separation of the discussion of subsidies which obstruct climate change from the discussion of, say, carbon taxes, which are to promote climate mitigation, right? And so, it reinforces the importance of subsidies. I just want to ask a specific question to you about whether we are correct in assuming that subsidies of fossil fuels should be separate from domestic policy, because it does greatly precede the climate change debate. I mean, that was our working assumption. Would you affirm that or not?
Well, the degree to which that climate policy is politicized means that it can be difficult to get policy movement on things that have its name associated with it, would be the first thing that I would say. But, subsidies aren't just things like tax incentives, but they include low royalty and tax rates where, in the United States, the Department of Interior right now is just evaluating the degree to which our royalty rates don't line up with the value of the resources that we're leasing. And so I think that the idea here really is, on one hand, the ideal in order to affect the kind of dramatic shifts that are necessary to meet the moment here, it would be subsidy reduction and elimination. And in general, what we've seen, and I was part of a federal advisory committee through the Department of Interior that looked at its financial relationship with the oil and gas industry. And one of the first things that fell off the table was the subsidy discussion. And part of the reason was naming things, argument over naming things specifically, but also in that these are really core relationships, longstanding financial relationships between a country and the companies that operate there, as you point out. And so I think we need disclosure is important so that we can bring in all those other actors in the process of like investors, like the international community, in comparing and naming and shaming, but also showing from a market standpoint why highly subsidized oil industries perform worse and why companies that benefit off them perform worse as well. So I think both the disclosure and specific policy reduction measures are really important, but they can work together, and the paper makes a really good case for why.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thanks to both our discussants. I'm going to open up the floor with some questions and answers as they're posted. And if you have questions and answers, please feel free to post them. And I'm going to be the moderator. So maybe, if whoever would take this among the discussants and my co-author, and I mean, if I can also take a few afterwards, but, first question is about whether the slides will be shared with the audience. The entire video will be saved to the website of the Center for Environmental Policy. And again, I mean, a couple of people have requested the paper. We're still finishing the next round, but we'll be glad to send it if you give us your email. A question about the international versus domestic policy commitments track with different types of countries, which is sort of the 4 cells we showed, I guess, and which Dr. West said we should integrate further into our initial models, which we should definitely think about. The global north has technology to curb emissions, while the global south does not, and may rely on future capacity building as a result of international policy. That seems like more of a statement than a question, but I think we show that some of the countries are somewhat reticent to participate fully in the international regime of climate commitments, in part because they want to develop economically. I think that was cell B of the 4 cells we showed that probably best represents the kind of countries you're talking about. So your question, I think, will be represented in the behavior of that group versus the other, right? I mean, Jennifer, do you want to add anything? All right. Well, let me go on and take one or two more, and then I'll come back and we'll see if anyone else wants to take. All right. So someone who does work in the Institute of Political Science and the Oshger Center for Climate Change Research at the University of Bern in Switzerland says that they want to ask a preliminary question, in which is the following. Preliminary work has found a difference between the ambition laid out in countries' NDCs and national policies. How did we take this into consideration in developing our indices? He is going to reach out so that we can talk about this a little bit more. But do you want to take that a little bit, Jennifer, or do you want?
Well, we kind of discussed this earlier this morning, right? Whether the NDCs actually capture domestic policy. And I think we settled on primarily no, but it's the best we have at this moment. So if you have any suggestions on like other ways that we can do this, that would be very welcome.
Good answer. Okay, thanks. All right, so another question from Dan Fiorino, who's the director of the Center for Environmental Policy, who says, what does this research tell us about the role of regular COPs, that is the UN meetings every year, and how to make them more effective? I mean, having been to a couple of COPs, I guess I could start to answer that by saying it seems that the problem isn't the COPs, the problem is between the COPs. And so, if there were more accountability for what countries promise at COPs, then we would really have a lot fewer issues between COPs. And I guess that's what we're arguing for, is a harmonization of the domestic policy. The domestics have to implement the policy. The international arena is the platform for, making claims about policy. So I think the Paris Agreement claims to be continuing to add accountability mechanisms for, following through on what actually happens after countries make pledges. But as we have seen in a realm of areas, a large realm of areas, that hasn't really happened so far. So I guess that would be the initial answer. I don't know if anybody else would like to add to that. No, okay. Another question, as we become more internet dependent, hence the webinar, does this ever increase the demand for energy? How can we reduce the demand for energy? Maybe, Dan has a book on sort of the energy transition that he might be able to speak with us. But I guess, I guess the internet would claim to use a lot less energy than having these meetings person to person. I think that would be the answer. But yes, the internet does use energy, but it's a lot less. Those of us who are attending fewer conferences are using many fewer emissions without traveling by plane and such things. I don't know. Does anybody want to throw in on this?
I just wanted to say that, it's not necessarily energy. in and of itself that's the problem. It's where we're getting our energy. So if we can make the transition to more renewable sources of energy, rather than relying so heavily on fossil fuels, then I think that is kind of the compromise that we're looking for, right? It's not so much the demand on energy, but where those sources of energy is coming from.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. All right. Another question. How are fossil fuel subsidies best measured? Should the IMF maximalist, inclusive of societal costs definition be used? What are some tips for working with this data? From a PhD student at the University of Oregon, where they have a great data set, we should say, on international treaties, by the way, right? Ron, gosh, yes, we use that data set. Anyway, does anybody want to take that on? I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, right? I mean, from a standpoint of our methodology, if we use the maximal IMF fossil fuel subsidies, it overwhelms our models. In other words, we got better, well, we got other variables in the relationship by using the explicit subsidies. We did use both. We used the maximalist subsidies in some of the runs, and we decided to only present the minimalist because it just gives us more to talk about in our models. Because again, if you use the maximalist fossil fuel subsidies, it can absorb the significance from some of the other variables, right? I mean, I don't know if anybody would like to add to that. All right, moving on, we have another question about wanting to hear more about our approach to operationalizing international and domestic ambition. And in particular, why do you not include the Paris Agreement among the core international agreements as an indicator of international ambition? Why do you consider NDCs and net zero pledges as indicators of domestic rather than international ambition? These are good questions. And why carbon pricing but no other domestic policy instruments as indicators of domestic ambition? What is your intuition about how these choices affect your results? I mean, as professors tend to do if they can, they turn the hard questions over to their PhD students. But if you want to start, I'll come in afterwards. All right, is that all right, Jennifer?
Yeah, so in the initial runs that we did a couple months ago, we did include the Paris Agreement. It didn't have like a different impact than just using the other three that we included. For the NDCs and the net zero pledges, the justification was that these are pledges done at the international level, but these are what the countries are saying that they're going to do at a domestic level. So I think that was the justification. Do you want to take the carbon pricing one?
Sure. And just to add one more statement about the Paris Agreement, which is that it really didn't have any variance, right? Pretty much everyone signed the Paris Agreement pretty quickly. So in order to get variance, we used the earlier agreements, and we figured that, one agreement was as good as another. That is to say, these were the basis upon which the international climate regime was based. And so we used the first three rather than the fourth, as the fourth really, everyone signed it lockstep pretty soon after it was, after the initial negotiation. All right, so on the question of carbon pricing, that was the most readily available domestic policy instrument that we could highly recognize as important. We also looked at the net zero pledge and at the NDCs as domestic policy instruments, even though that has been criticized, but we've looked at those because at the end of the day, those are domestic choices. They are to comply with international suggestions or pressure, but they are domestic choices. And we thought those were the best because they are conscious moments of effort and thought about the policies that a nation wants to take. They're no doubt questionable. And if the person who asked the question has other suggestions besides carbon pricing of strong domestic indicators that are measured uniformly across the globe, which is a criterion for this, then we would be glad to add those. I mean, the questions are very good. And I guess the question about how these choices affect our results, I think it's clearly certain that they diminish our results if we're trying to look at just domestic policy. But I think, as Jennifer well said, there aren't a lot of measures of domestic versus international policy. In fact, we didn't really have any. And so we just figure it's much better than nothing. And it's an interesting start of an important dialogue that we would like to get going. And we've learned that there are other people working on this, and a couple of them appeared, a couple of European university colleagues appeared this morning who we're going to interact with about this, but there's still not a lot of this out there, not a lot of discussion of this. And so I guess that's our justification, and maybe it's an excuse, but it is what it is. Okay, and so what other questions? The taxonomy that we have created, reminds a researcher of Climate Leaders, Laggards, and Pioneers by Tobin and colleagues. Yeah, we should look at that. Thank you. Any other questions? Let's see, we have one or two other questions. Renewables are important, but land is becoming a scarce resource. Countries, including Denmark, which is a forerunner in renewables, are having huge difficulties getting onshore windmills accepted in local communities. We need energy efficiency policies no matter what. So I think that harkens back to Professor West's comment about the idea that, the importance is the source of the energy rather than, entirely how much is saved. Okay, another question. Could you distinguish net zero goals that are embodied in law rather than just statement of intention? And actually, I think that's what we did, right? We talked about how integrated they were, whether they were legislated or whether they were just statements by executives, right? I mean, that was pretty much, that was how we did the net zero commitments. So thank you. Thank you for that, Dan. Any other comments or questions? It seems that time may be drawing to an end. And I guess, we like to go at an hour and 15 minutes maximum. Would either of the discussants like to make a statement of any further comments? Anybody? No? I guess, Jennifer, any further comments?
No.
Okay, then my last comment will just be to thank our discussants, my co-author, the Center for Environmental Policy, colleagues at the School of Public Affairs who helped us set this webinar up, and to encourage you to please join us at our next webinar, which, if I'm not mistaken, is February 24th with Claire Dupont of the University of Ghent, talking about sort of the circumstances of mitigation in Europe. Again, thank you very much. Have a great day. Enjoy the beautiful weather without asking what's caused it. No, ask what caused it. Ask what caused it. All right, thank you. Thank you, and have a great day.